Hello, Personnel Psych. How are you guys doing today? All right, we're going to talk about interviews, and within interviews, we're going to talk a little bit about competencies. This is going to get us to one of our homework assignments. So let us just dive in. Let's get started with this. I'll say this: the interviews versus coin toss. Traditional interviews rely heavily on gut judgment and general perception that we possess capabilities that don't really exist, that we believe that we can see into someone's souls. I remember the famous line, and I shuddered upon hearing it. I mean, the intent was good, was when George Bush Jr. met with Vladimir Putin, and he said, "I looked into his eyes and I saw his soul." And it's like, no, buddy, you didn't. You don't have any magic powers like that. And psychologists, probably are better able to understand this than anyone, especially clinicians, this idea that we can just look in and see someone's soul. Not so much, right? So interviews, while people pride themselves on their ability, their supposed ability to interview someone and get at that true person, this is not borne out by empirical research, right? Traditional interviews are subject to impression management skills of candidates, and I'll admit that I've gone into many interviews with the pre-thought of what do they want to hear. And to the extent that I can predict what somebody wants to hear, then I can answer questions in a way that pleases them. And then, but see, we're not getting at who I am or the nature or the goodness of fit or any of that. Basically, what it is I need a job, you hold the keys to the entry to that job, and to the extent that I want that job, I'm going to say what you need to hear to give me that job. So psychopaths especially excel at interviews, and let's think about psychopaths: glib, superficially charming, manipulative, intelligent psychopaths, clever, fun to be around, right? And these are people that during the interview, with good impression management, you create the sense in these folks that not only can I do this job, but you're going to love to have me around. That is, interviewers are relatively easy to manipulate, and they believe otherwise. So traditional interviews do little to minimize implicit biases, which is another issue, right? And we've talked maybe a little bit in this class about this bias, but it's got a cute little name, just like me bias, often prevalent in the selection process. That is, we tend to want to hire people who are a lot like us, right? Because we're cool, we're awesome, so why wouldn't we want to hire people that are like us? We're more likely to get along with them. But notice, separating impression management skill from skill at doing the job the candidate is potentially being selected for are two very different things, right? Unless the job has a bona fide occupational qualification of a high level of impression management, and then that might be another story. So if we're going to craft a structured interview to get around some of these problems, what we need to do then is it's a pretty straightforward process. The job requirements to be measured by structured interview identify the actions, behaviors that illustrate each qualification. And notice, when we looked at the Repertory Grid, and you guys built your Repertory Grid, this is one place where we begin to get that information. ONET is another place we begin to get that information. So we start building this picture of what the job entails, what's done on the job, and then again, person specifications is what type of person is likely to do that best. And then we try to convert that into measurable either performance evaluation or interview questions, right? Write questions that will generate relevant information about the degree to which the candidate possesses each job requirement. So that really is kind of at the core of it, right? Create an answer key with benchmark responses for at least the high, middle, and low scores on the scale. Okay, so, and I'm a big fan. I saw this in one of your previous assignments. I think it was homework 5, and I didn't take any points off of it. The first homework I looked at, I said, oh my God, this is kind of missing. But then I looked at the next homework that was turned in, and then the one after that, and the one after that, and they were all done identically, so the failure was mine. But really, each scale point, and we had 5 scale points in the Repertory Grid assignment, each one of those deserves a label, right? And that was not done. So I'm going to stress that as we move through this, right? So we create an answer key with benchmark responses that each scale point labeled in some meaningful way. Weight the benchmark responses based on the importance of the question relative to others. So that is, we have the ability to place more value on certain questions than others. That's getting a little advanced. We're not going to exploit that process in this assignment. Select and train interviewers to increase the interviewer's standardization, reliability, and validity. The deal is we want everyone to do it the same way, but at the same time we want multiple interviewers. Okay? Evaluate the effectiveness of the structured interview in terms of validity of the reactions of stakeholders, including how the job related and how they might perceive it to be. So once we craft what we believe is a good interview, then we probably should find some incumbents who maybe helped us previously and then show the incumbency interview process. Or if we're really cool and we're really on the ball, what we do is we ask some incumbents to come in and we train our interviewers to use the interview with incumbents. And if there's any problems, then we should probably discover them at this point in time. This is a cheap way. Remember pilot testing. I'll give you an example. I just got a survey surveying instructors at Ohio State about how arts and sciences does its grading. I'm sorry, it came from the Student Senate. It was the most horrible survey I've ever read. It was just awful. And I'm thinking, who produced this? And how did they believe that they're going to get any useful data out of it? I mean, I've had courses in survey design, so maybe I'm a little harsh. But it's like, hey, this is a double-barreled question. This question has not even close to the number of probable response options. It's like, I don't know. It was like it was almost written in grade school. And the problem is it's just going to generate data that's unreliable. That needed to be pilot tested. And the same with interviews. It's really a benefit to pilot test them. It's really expensive to send these things out, right? Involve a lot of people with answering them, bringing them back and attempting to analyze the results, and find out that all you manage to get out of it is gobbledygook, right? So we're talking about step-by-step methodological, very methodical approach to doing this. So we'll talk about the types of interviews. One of the reasons, though, that standardized interviews are so important, that is, we ask every candidate the same question in the same order, and all interviewers are trained to do it in the same way. A lot of research has found that the just like me bias, right, what we have is when candidates are perceived by interviewers to be just like them, they usually then, the interview goes longer. It's more free-flowing and more questions are asked, right? When we detect a candidate that is not like me, what we end up doing is seeing shorter interviews, less exploration of answers, right? So that basically people are being treated unfairly during the interview process. They're not getting the same opportunity on the basis of their perceived category membership, which is part of the just like me bias. So standardization is key here, right? Standardized questions, standardized order, standardized procedure, standardized rubric for evaluating, scoring interviewees' answers. Okay. Now, let's look at these types of structured interviews. The behavioral interview, using information about what the applicant has done in the past to predict future behaviors, right? So for a teacher, you might ask a question like, do you recall a time when a student came to you and complained about their grade? What did you do? And think about it. When you're, when I looked at your repertory grids and I looked at the qualities you said that good teachers possessed versus what bad teachers possessed, note how this question is in line with what many of you were thinking along at least one dimension in terms of what is a good teacher, right? Situational interviews, asking people how they might react to a hypothetical situation. So now we say suppose, etc., right? And then we gauge the nature of the response. Case interviews. Give the candidate a situation, a problem, or challenge and ask him to address and resolve it. All three of these outperform unstructured interviews, right? That are typically used to compare candidates. So remember when I told you about those nasty-ass Boise Cascade interviews where they say, hey, for the next hour, just tell me about you. How can we score applicants equally across that interview? Unstructured interviews immediately favor people who are good at impression management. Pure and simple. So, interview questions then should be inspired by the identified KSAOs. So, whether it's behavioral, whether it's situational, whether it's case, interview questions should be tapping directly into one or more of those prioritized KSAOs, right? So when we look at your repertory grid, you got boom, boom, boom. Let's take what you rank as the 5 or 6 most important qualities that are described from your experience with good teachers versus bad teachers, as we used, right? And then craft an interview question to tap into each one of those dimensions of performance, right? So this is how we use the KSAOs as identified by our job analysis and the creation of person specifications, the repertory grid being one tool in the creation of these. Always ask why this question. As soon as you write a question, why this question, right? And when you ask why this question, can you point directly with ease to the KSAO that it represents? If you go, wow, I'm not sure what that's tapping into, then it's time to rewrite that question. It's time to dump that question to clarify, to more directly assess the person specification inspired by the KSAO. Okay? So, is the interview question the type that's the best fit to the KSAO is the second question we ask, and that goes back to, is it behavioral, situational, or case interviews? And you're going to have a chance to practice all of these, right? So when we score structured interviews, I don't know if you remember, so I'm going to remind you, because maybe some don't, critical incident technique, right? Remember when we were talking about job analysis and the creation of person specifications, we talked about this one technique, the critical incident technique. So here's where we've brought in SMEs at that point, and we've interviewed the SMEs, especially in terms of a critical incident. And what we say is, boy, tell me, and this is during the not the candidate interview process, but this is the interview process of our SMEs when we're trying to tap into KSAOs and person specifications. We might ask the question, hey, tell me about one of the greatest challenges you've ever had to face in your position as general manager. What is one of the most difficult situations you ever had to face, and how did you resolve it? And did you resolve it successfully to your satisfaction or not? So what we're taking is a critical incident, or tell us about a time when all production in the factory ceased. How did you get it started, right? So it's this critical incident that can form the basis of excellent interview questions and the way to score them. So, interview responses that characterize poor responses to critical incidents for the bottom end of the scoring rubric, while responses characterized as superior can serve as comparison elements for the high end. So by looking at what's been done in the past, and then we craft an interview question along that vein, right, within that domain, and then we have the ability to say, wow, this would be a really shitty way to handle that situation. This would be a really great way. And this, then, if we're going to go with just the 3-point system in a 5-point scale, let's say, with 3 labels, right? And then the second is an adequate way to deal with it, but could be done better. So that would be our second response option. Now, here's the deal. I'm a trained interviewer. You're my interviewee. I ask you this question inspired by the SMEs in the critical incident, And now I can compare your answer to the best answer possible, to the worst answer possible, or to an average answer. And now I have a rubric for scoring it. And if we're trained, if we have multiple interviewers, and we're all trained in the same manner, we're going to use this rubric in the same manner. And what happens is then we collect data that's reliable. It doesn't matter who's conducting the interview. It doesn't matter who's being interviewed. Our process guarantees, or at least assures, a high level of reliability. That is interviewer to interviewer, candidate to candidate. It's fair, it's unbiased as possible, and it gives everyone the greatest satisfaction having completed the interview. And think about it. What happens then is interviewees walk away from your process saying, wow. Well, first of all, they're going to think they really have their shit together. But they ask me a lot of stuff that is just tremendously on point to the nature of the job that I just applied for. Have you ever applied for a job when you sit down with a manager who's going to, or supervisor, and give you this off-the-cuff interview and is asking questions that you're saying, why are they asking me this? It has nothing to do with the performance of the job, at least to my mind. Right? And then you walk away with a bad taste in your mouth. That can create spillover effects as we discussed before. So, incumbents and SMEs can also be a source of potential response options in developing the scoring rubric. So again, when we're pilot testing questions, we might in fact ask SMEs then, what do you believe would be a good response versus what would be a poor response? What would be something in between? So we get help and we work through this. Remember, Dr. Deming said that experts in a process are the people who actually perform the task. The people who are closest to the process, those that run the process, are the experts on that process. So it often makes sense to involve them in other aspects of the personnel selection process. So the Repertory Grid, as we used it, right, is a great organizing method for determining competencies and also a useful source in locating interviewee incumbents to develop the scoring rubric. Remember, if you classified 5 or 6 teachers, right, as being top-notch, and you want to pilot test your questionnaire, maybe you take it to them and you ask them, hey, can you help me with this? Will you look this over and see what you think of this? And then help with developing the rubric. It was pretty, I'm going to return to that survey I looked at, right, about grading in arts and sciences. And I didn't even finish the survey. I got about halfway through, and then I just went to the end and commented, said the data you're going to collect is going to be meaningless from the survey. But I mean, it's just fascinating that I know I don't think they could have shown that to any instructors. I don't think they showed that survey to any instructors before they started putting it out there. Because I just can't believe that many instructors would have just said, oh yeah, this looks great. No, it doesn't look great. It doesn't begin to tap into what I do or how I view grading, and that's what you're trying to figure out. Right? Let's look at the types of interview questions, and we have some examples here. And note, we have example questions and we have example scales. So you feel free to use these examples to kind of form your own questions, right? So this first question is, hey, tell me about a time when you were working on a project that you felt was important, but others thought it was a waste of time. What did you do, and what was the result? Okay. Well, an excellent answer is I pursued the project despite the obstacles because I really believed in it. I wanted the project to succeed, and I tried to find ways around problems. Okay. Top answer. Mid-range answer, and notice we got a 5-point scale, so it allows us to give someone a 4 if they're halfway in between 3 and 5, but you really need at least 3 scale labels. 5 would be ideal, but hey. So, a marginal answer, I continued working on the project, but shifted my focus to other projects that had higher probabilities of success. And then finally, a poor answer, once I felt that the project had low support, I stopped working on it. And then I want you to consider, okay, so what is this question attempting to tap into, right? And we can see that there's probably several qualities that are reflected in the answers to these questions. I think grit or stick-to-itiveness might be one that's well represented in this question, but that would be up to discussion. I think it's a great discussion for you to have within your team. Now, behavioral question, right? Let's talk about a situational interview question. Okay, imagine that you're currently very busy working on several important projects with firm deadlines, but your supervisor brings you a stack of unrelated paperwork to complete that you feel is unrelated to any of your projects. In addition, you're certain that attending to this new paperwork will cause you to miss several project deadlines. What do you do? And no, this is a really good question. And I think of my wife. This often happens to my wife, that she's got multiple projects ongoing with relatively firm deadlines, and then some attorney tosses something at her that really is of relatively low priority but expects it to be done like yesterday, right? How do you handle that? That's a real world problem, right? That's a situation that many of us will encounter or have encountered in our work, right? This is something I've encountered in my work. So, you know, one of the things when we had to convert all our courses to online, then some people are coming at us saying, hey, we need this, we need that. And it's just like, no, that's inappropriate to even ask for that at this time. We have bigger fish to fry, right? And often instructors have to remind administrators of that. But let's see what we need to say, right? Well, 5 is explain the conflict to my supervisor and try to identify and discuss alternatives. It would be important to me to ensure that any changes were acceptable to both my manager and myself. So that's, okay, if you want me to do this, if you want me to drop everything else and put this ahead, do we understand what the consequences of that decision are? And are you willing to accept those consequences? Or now that we understand those consequences, should we just kind of put this project on the back burner and continue to work on the high priority items, right? The deal is, great answer to a difficult situation. Now, marginal, tell my supervisor about the conflict. Note, though, we don't engage the supervisor in part of the problem-solving situation. So it's just like, hey, you know, I got other stuff on. And then we leave it at that. Well, okay, it's true, and it's relatively assertive, but it doesn't necessarily move us towards any problem-solving. And then the poor answer, accept the conflict as part of the job and do the best I can. Which is probably then do the best I can is going to end up satisfying nobody and maybe becoming a bad mark on one's performance in evaluation time. Questions about that? Okay, and you can see the case interview is just give them a case, and a case interview is usually when you have to design something to make something happen. Notice behavior, straight up behavior, situation is about a situation. A case is often something more forward looking. Suppose that you need to develop this new product, right? In what fashion are you going to work? Now, let us then move on to the STAR technique. And the STAR technique, this is one of the hidden bonuses of personnel psychology. When we think in terms of putting other people in the hot seat, asking them questions, testing their performance, right? Analyzing jobs as personnel psychology. But the hidden context is, as we learn the ins and outs of personnel psychology, it should make us be more attractive candidates because we know the process that's being employed. And if we know the process that's being employed, we can use it to our advantage to a greater degree. And that's where the STAR technique comes in. So this is a technique for answering behavioral interview questions. Right? So someone maybe gives you a situation or a task, and task is akin to case in this context, right? Describe in enough detail for the interviewer to understand the situation and what you need to accomplish, right? The action that you took and the results that you achieved. So they might ask you a question like, describe a time where you made a significant contribution to your department. Okay? Well, now I'm going to lay out the situation. Hey, this is what was going on, right? and based on what was going on, this is what I did, and having done that, this is the results that were achieved. If we practice this, when we go into an interview, then we can be far more organized and efficient in our response, right? That is, we can look like we've got, for lack of a better term, our shit together, right? So another way to look at the STAR task, right? So again, prepare, listen to the question, and think of an event. You don't have to answer within 3 seconds of being asked this question. It's okay to say something like, and often when you're preparing for the question, what you say is, wow, that is a fascinating question. Let me think for a moment and come up with an example that you might find useful. All right? So now you've bought yourself a little time, and you give yourself 30 seconds or a minute, but you're not going to need a lot of time to think about that because you're already half ready for this, because now you've learned this and you know the technique that you can use to answer the questions. Penelope, what are you doing? Okay. So, describe the situation or the event. Hey, you know what? I remember when, and then this is what I had to do. This is the action I took, and this is how it all worked out, right? And notice that even if it didn't work out perfectly, let's say, you might even want to extend, if your audience looks willing, then when you talk about the result, and you can say things like, well, in hindsight, I'm relatively pleased with the result, but I think the result could have been better had I actually done this. And man, now you're really winning them over, because they're viewing in you this reflective quality that assesses one's results honestly and is using that information to in fact create potentially better results. So, STAR technique example, situation. Hey, I was part of the customer service team. We experienced poor customer satisfaction and several customer complaints due to the inconsistency of the line of service, right? So being one of the most senior team members, I was asked to propose ideas on how to improve the situation. That was the task you were given. And then you go on to describe the action you took, and then finally the result. Okay? And that's kind of an example that's near and dear to my heart, because my promotion at Boise Cascade, when I got to the Wallula mill, is I became the assistant supervisor for quality control, and this is what I did. Is I tracked customer data, customer complaints, managed the complaint system, and sought to reduce the number of complaints through process improvement. So, enough on the STAR technique, but I'll tell you what, if you learn this, you are going to look awesome in your interviews, right? And in fact, what you're going to find is you might leave a lot of interviewers almost speechless because you're going to be so good, right? And isn't that what it's about? This is an opportunity to shine. So let's learn the methods which ensure that we shine brighter than any of the other candidates. Right? Because it's a bitch out there. It's competitive. And it's meaningful. I've talked to you a couple of times about the Boise Cascade hiring process. And they hired 15 of us at one time. 15, we all went through the assessment center, 60 of us, and then they hired 15, right? So it was a 25% selection ratio, if you want to get down to that, right? From the initial 200 candidates. But then, because we're a union, and it's the same for most companies, we have to be put in some kind of order, because seniority is everything. For promotions, for selecting jobs, etc., you have to be ordered. You can't have 15 people hired on the same date. So what they do is boom, 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 5-minute intervals. This is the person, if there's 100 people existing and you hire 15, okay, there's 100 people existing, union employees, then these 15, someone has to be 101. Someone has to be 102. Someone has to be 103, and then someone's going to be 115. The deal is, when layoffs come, if layoffs come, last person hired is the first person laid off. So, if you're hired in that 15 and you make it to 1, what that means in the real world is 14 people will be laid off before they come for your ass. And that can be a huge difference in your ability to pay your bills, etc. And fortunately, through this interview process, 3 of us, and these other 2 guys became my good friends at work, right? Brian Baker and Joe Rodriguez, man, we were 1, 2, and 3. And that insulated us to a huge extent from the layoffs that other people were suffering. Bad for them, but fortunately gave us a little more security. Understanding interview techniques, interviewing well, right? Having relevant experience, performing well on assessment tests. This can have a profound effect, right? Even if you are hired within the group that you're hired. Now I have a submodule here. Let's call it Competencies, more on Competencies. And you see this is lecture 3.12, so let's get fancy and call this 3.21, if you will. Let's talk a little bit about competencies, because competencies are in fact part of this process. So what is a competency? It's a set of observable performance dimensions, including individual knowledge, skills, attitudes, behaviors, as well as collective, team, process, organizational capabilities. Notice, when you developed a repertory grid, what you identified were, in fact, could be described as competencies, right? They're linked to high performance, and you already did that because you identified high performers, and these are the competencies that possess. And then you look at the low performers, and you can say, well, I can see why we consider this person a low performer, because they don't really possess this competency, right? What we're talking about, though, is giving the organization a sustainable competitive advantage, at least from a business point of view. Now, competencies are demonstrable capabilities. It's knowledge or skills associated with current job performance. And on your repertory grid, notice how many of you had knowledge or subject knowledge as one of the components, right? Competencies can also be emerging knowledge or skills required for future success. It can be intellectual or behavioral best practices of high-performing people or teams. And you also identified those, maybe not directly, but indirectly on your repertory grid. Process capabilities that enhance organization or business performance. Again, tangentially, at worst, but much closer to that on qualities, competencies you developed on that repertory grid. New ways of thinking and behaving that provide distinctive competitive advantage. Right? And many of us are looking at that now. Many of us never intended to be online instructors, but holy shit, you know? All of a sudden, after a year now, I say, I have a whole new skill set developing. Yes, it needs a lot of improvement, but I've developed this new skill set to become an online instructor. A fascinating skill to develop by surprise, by demand, by requirement, by COVID, however you want to put that. But it does then kind of broaden one's resume, if you will, and potential employment opportunities. Okay. Now, McClellan introduces the competency approach. He observes shortcomings in trait and intelligence approach to predicting performance. That is, intelligence doesn't necessarily correlate well to much of what we need to see on the job, right? Or other traits like outgoing or so when we look at competencies, what we're doing is looking at things that can be done that directly relate to a good performance or a poor performance on the job. Much of what you were looking at in the repertory grid, right? It was introduced into the domain of academic achievement testing, and it was rapidly adopted by business. McClellan introduced 5 key advantages to the competency approach. Okay? So let's see what McClellan has to say. The best way to understand performance is to observe people, what people actually do to be successful. That is, the competencies that they possess, rather than relying on assumptions about underlying traits or attributes such as intelligence. So if we give trait tests or we give intelligence tests, what we're saying is people with these traits or this intelligence can perform this competency better. And what McClellan's saying, what the hell? Let's get rid of the intelligence and traits and find ways to measure someone's level on the competency itself. Why use a surrogate or some kind of underlying component when we can test the quality of the competency itself? Advantage number 2. The best way to measure and predict performance is to have people perform key aspects of the competency you want to measure rather than administering a test to assess underlying traits or attributes. So measure directly, right? And in one of the future examples in one of your assignments that I've been writing up, it's not finished yet because I want to work on it a little more. I mean, I like it so far, but it needs more work. It needs to be spruced up, is looking at patience. And I was inspired by you guys because on your Repertory Grid, some of you put patience, and I'm like, well, how the hell am I going to measure patience, right? And you'll see this is coming in a future assignment. So hopefully the description of this assignment is even better, maybe one of the best ones I've written so far. But how do I measure patience? And what I've done for that assignment is I'm actually spelling it out. What did I do when I was faced with that question? What was my actual process, right? And for me, one of the competencies that I need to possess is clarity. So I'm always thinking in terms of, am I delivering clear instructions, right? Well, how can you test that? And it's like, well, you could have someone come in and create instructions, right? And you could say how clear, you could evaluate the instructions for clarity. You don't have to evaluate my intelligence. You don't have to evaluate my verbal ability or any of this underlying nonsense. What you need to do is evaluate my ability to develop a clear set of instructions. And notice, that's something that could be given to someone in an assessment center. So we're talking about measuring competencies in a much more direct fashion according to McClellan's point number 2. Now, point number 3, competencies can be learned and developed over time in contrast to traits and attributes that are viewed as inherent and largely unmutable. Let's face it, you can't change people, right? Now, people can change. That's not what I'm saying, right? There's 2 rules. What are my 2 basic rules of psychology? 2 rules that I hope everyone walks away with if you've been in one of my psychology courses. 2 rules. Rule number 1, you can't change people. Yes, people can change if they want to, but you can't change them, right? You can't change people. And rule number 2 is the best predictor of future behavior, all else being equal, is past behavior. And notice how that fits to the competency model too. What I want to assess is behaviors, abilities, competencies, because that best predicts what someone will do in the future. Underlying traits become somewhat meaningless, or at least so detached that they become unreliable surrogate measures for what we want to measure as, can the person do this job, right? So let us not focus on traits then. Let's leave it alone. All kidding aside, the Myers-Briggs is not going to get us anywhere. Nationwide, spending hundreds of thousands, maybe $1 million on personanalysis is an idiotic gambit. I mean, but it made a bunch of people a little more wealthy, right? So, McClellan, competency approach advantage. Number 4, competency should be made visible and accessible to people so they understand, develop the required level of performance, rather than being cloaked in a veil of mystery associated with inborn innate factors, or they've got it and other people don't. You're either born with it or not, right? That kind of entity kind of thinking. Let's take that incremental approach. Hey, there's nothing mysterious about this, right? Writing clear instructions. The first set of instructions you ever write, hey, they may not be all that clear. But as you practice over time, the clarity of the instructions should increase. So it's not by some mystery that I write instructions that you can understand. It's not by some unknown force that I possess, right? It's just essentially learning to be more and more clear and developing techniques, tactics, processes that allow us to increase our clarity, right? So it's not let's not call it a mystery. Let's not make these hidden skills, right? And then The competency, number 5. Competency should be linked to meaningful life outcomes to describe the way people perform in the real world rather than esoteric mental traits that only psychologists can understand. When we start engaging in that psychobabble, we turn people off in a real frickin' hurry. So let's try to get closer to reality every time we explain something, right? Develop rationales that are understandable to everyone and not couched in mysterious terms. Right? And some of us academics have a problem with that, especially because we love our vocabulary. We love our vernacular because it makes us sound frickin' awesome. But for most people, it's probably off-putting when you get right down to it. Now, I know in the university often we use vocabulary and we use the terminology for a lot of different reasons. And part of it, I think, is consumer satisfaction. I think you'd like to think you're being taught by someone who is intelligent, and high up in the field than being taught by some dumbass, right? So, all else being equal. Let's get the heck out of here. Let's return back to 3.12. Should we do blind or double-blind interviews? Right? To what extent should we blind or double-blind interviews? And this becomes an interesting topic. I'll tell you when I really start thinking about this, as it says here, it was in a previous iteration of this course. I had a hearing impaired student who was accompanied by a transcriber. I remember we were in PS 6, I believe. I love teaching in that room. I don't get to see the PS rooms much anymore because my classes have grown in enrollment beyond what the PS rooms, the psychology building classrooms, can accommodate. But I remember it was amazing, right? Because a hearing impaired student would sit there with their computer, and then there was a transcriber that sat right behind her or right next to her. And I talked a lot to the transcriber. Her former career was court reporter, right? So she did the transcribing in the courtroom. And essentially her device was very similar to that. So as I'm lecturing along, man, she's and it's immediately showing up on the student's laptop screen. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so freaking awesome, right? And I was impressed with her skill because I know sometimes I talk really fast. And she's just like, no sweat, I got this down, right? So she demonstrated that competency for sure. She was a fascinating person to talk to. But it gave me an idea. Think about interviews. We don't necessarily have to do interviews face-to-face. If we do interviews face-to-face, then, gender bias could come in, ethnicity bias might come in, age bias might come in. So you say, well, why do we have to interview face-to-face? What we could do is we could put a screen up and we could have the interviewer so they can't see the candidate. And then none of those visual biases could be creative. But then I thought, well, the problem with that is, though, we can still hear the voice and we can determine if the voice has an accent or if it's a masculine versus a feminine voice or any other characteristics we want to, attribute to different vocal styles. And I thought, well, but check this shit out. If we had a transcriber, right, they could be transcribing the questions and answers, boom, 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 like this, right? And no one would even have to hear the candidate. And yet we would have the benefit of a live interview. Something to consider. I don't know. I know you guys could list a bunch of pros, and some of you have already probably come up with a bunch of cons, and good on you for that. Always go to the cons. Well, that won't work because that's how we learn, right? Pros and cons, develop that list. So I don't know. As I lectured, the lecture was what would be gained or lost in doing this in an interview setting. It's just a thought experiment, nothing more than that. All right, so some very basic interview design considerations. Right off the bat, the interview questions have to have the potential to differentiate the candidates. If we ask a question that every candidate is going to answer in the exact same way, or with the same level, assessed level of response via the rubric, then that question does us no good, right? If we ask the question, is it important to be honest, and everyone says yes, 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 all 15 applicants give us the same answer, then the question has not differentiated the candidates and it needs to be removed from the question pool. Now, let's get back to McClellan. Are competencies being assessed? Not traits, right, but honest-to-God competencies. Is the process free from potential bias, right? Is the scoring rubric reliable? That is, if different people use it. And one way to do this is we can interview a subject matter expert, or we can interview a high-performing incumbent, right? We can videotape that interviewer, and that interviewee, and as part of the interview training, then we can have potential trainee interviewers score the video of this subject matter expert and see if the rubric is reliable. That is, if our 10 interviewer trainees all score the person the same way on the same question. And that'll give us a good idea of how our rubric is performing. Right? Now, you might be saying, oh my God, Mark, how long is it going to be before we actually craft and are able to use this interview? Because you've suggested about 80,000 steps to producing an excellent interview. This goes back to your time. This goes back to your resources. This goes back to the importance of the hire, right? If we're hiring people for an entry-level position, like stacking boxes, then it's probably not that critical. But if we're hiring someone who's going to be making multi-million-dollar decisions for our company, or hiring supervisors that impact the life of 500 or 600 employees, maybe we should invest the time and energy in doing it as effectively as possible. But again, that's a sliding scale, right? Is the process free from a potential bias? Scoring rubric reliable? Is the time allotted sufficient? And this is why we should use the interview to see, man, we got these 5 questions, and we should be able to do that in an hour. But what if we can't? What if we get halfway through the interview and time's up? It's a little late to find that when you're actually interviewing honest-to-God candidates. You need to practice so you find that out beforehand, right? Then you need to either lengthen the interview allotment time or start removing questions. And that's a tough trade-off, right? Or reworking the questions. What level of training is necessary for the interviewers? And we should be able to see that by going through the mock interviews. Who will be interviewing? And that's an important consideration. You know, if we look at Johnsonville sausage, for example, and it's not a video I've shown you of the Tom Peters video set, but Ralph Stayer, who took over Johnsonville sausage once his parents retired, it's a family company, and Johnsonville sausage is a big company. Stayer and management don't interview candidates. They don't interview candidates for hiring. They don't interview candidates for promotion. People in the workforce have been trained to craft interviews, to score them, so you're interviewed by the people you'll be working with. And as Stayer and his, managers explain it, I don't work with these people. Wouldn't it make more sense for people who know more about the job and will have to work with these potential new employees, wouldn't it make more sense for them to do the interviewing? But notice that Stayer closes the loop. He doesn't just say, okay, employees, you do the interviews. He provides them the necessary training, and people who are interested in becoming interviewers attend the training, they learn the skills, they demonstrate the skills, they become interviewers, and they actually get a pay bump as a result of their additional ability at this point in time. Fascinating man, fascinating company, fascinating, very philosophical approach to running his organization. So, homework 9, here we go. Pick a job from the list in the previous assignment. You know the job. Develop 2x number of interview questions that are tied to the most important KSOs and competencies. Now, and that's up to you to determine, right, where X number of people on your team. So if you got 5 team members, I'm expecting 10 questions. Okay, again, I'm trying to learn from you guys in developing these teams. This means that if you got a smaller team, if you only got 3 people, then 6 questions. What I'm trying to do is make it fair. So I listen to you guys, I try to learn from you guys, and I try to continuously improve the approach to these assignments, right? So clearly identify the type of question as behavioral, situational, or case, right? So I want to make sure that you're able to do that. You understand the difference. We need at least 2 of each, behavioral, situational, or case, where possible, of the questions across the questions you create. Okay, so try to give a representative sample of all of those. Am I going to be counting? Probably not, but in spirit, mix it up, please. Okay. Now B, develop 5-point rubric for each question. Rubric should make it clear to each interviewer how to score the responses, as you saw in the examples. Rubric should make it clear to the candidate how they were scored if necessary. So if a candidate comes back to you and says, I want to know, I wasn't hired, and you say, well, your interview score was here, and the interview scores of the people we hired were there, right? And you can say, look, here's your answer, and this is how it was scored. And the person should be able to look at that and say, oh, okay, I see. The top level answer would have been more like this. Always be able to explain to people why they did or didn't get the job, right? Rubric should demonstrate high inter-rater reliability and between interview reliability. That one is going to be tough for you to assess in the context of this assignment. So, Rubric therefore needs labels for each of the 5 response options. And I really prefer 5 labels, not 3, right, as we've shown in the examples. But I'm not going to pitch a fit if you only give me 3 out of 5. What I will pitch a fit about on this particular assignment, though, is if you give me just the endpoints. I want at least that center point added in. I learned that from the Repertory Grid assignment. Okay. And you didn't get docked there because I was not clear about it. So, assignment template, A, question. Type. What type of question is it? Behavioral, situational, case. The rationale. What is the KSAO or competency that's assessed by this question? So be clear on that, right? And then, as a standalone interview sheet, so notice, for A, you have question 1, you'll have question 2, you have question 3, depending on how many team members you have, right? So that, and then the portion B, right, copy and paste the question here, then copy and paste the scoring scale and repeat for all your questions. So what you're going to do is, A is like, hey, these are the questions, and if you want to put your name on each question or whatever, but then B actually then becomes what an interview sheet would use. So it has the question and the scoring rubric, and it has all 10 questions in it, right? So A is what you would turn into me as your teacher. B then is what you would give to an interviewer so that they can go through the process. Questions about that? Not so much, huh? Well, if you do, you know where we can ask those questions in our meetings. Oh, and guess what? I just got an interesting email yesterday. You know, I've been pitching a fit about being made a senior lecturer, right? And part of being a senior lecturer is, Mark, you're entitled to 3-year contracts. And then COVID comes and they immediately take that away and say, we're only going to give you a 1-year contract. Well, it seems that my bosses in the psychology department have submitted a request to the university, whoever receives these requests, to offer me a 5-year contract. Holy shit, I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool. Thank you for that then. We'll see if it pans out, because they said we can't guarantee it, because who knows what the university will do. Once you start talking to bean counters, right, people in accounting and all these other mysterious people, they all have rationales of their own. But I found that exciting, and the deal is, guess what? It really doesn't matter. It's just that my bosses have thought enough to request this on my behalf. So whether I get the contract or not, right, what my bosses have done have demonstrated to me, you know what? We agree. We said you get extended contracts. We took it away. We don't think that's right. We want to offer to make that up to you. And when you're a manager, when you're a boss, I think one of the most important things that you can demonstrate is you have your people's back and you're willing to fight for them. So, that being said, not much else going on. Let's call it good for today. I am working on the next assignment as I described, but I really... I mean, what I got is probably usable now, but I want I want it to be better than usable. I want it to be bordering on awesome. And I know. Yes, it's a freaking assignment. Let's not get too self-involved there, right? So, but I know it can be done better, so I'm going to take a couple moments to make sure that it does get done better. Anyway, I hope you guys have a great day. And again, if you have any questions, you know who to ask. See you later.